Hello there, my name is Amanda Woolston, also known as the Declassified Adoptee. I am a licensed master social worker who has been writing and speaking and teaching about adoption for over a decade now. It all started with a blog, and now I obviously have a YouTube channel where I try to upload every Tuesday. In these uploads, I explore concepts that I wrote about on my blog years ago. Sometimes I spill some tea about what was going on in adoption activism at that time, and I give you updates on what I think about these topics now. If that sounds good to you, hit that like button, comment, please subscribe. It helps your adoptee content creators out a great deal when you remember to do this when you find us online. If you are at all familiar with the adoption community, whether at gatherings in person or online, there is this long-held disconnect between adoptees, fosterees, first parents, foster parents, and adoptive parents. We have spent decades trying to figure out why and also trying to mend it. Why? Because we need each other in various ways to bring equity and justice to our community. We need adoptive and foster parents to divest privilege and uplift those of us who are rarely seen or not often included. We need to protect first parents and their ability to contribute to discourse without fearing repercussions in their own personal lives and adoption situations. We need first parents to tell their stories, to help dispel harmful myths about adoption and about adoptees ourselves that have been embedded everywhere from policy to even in our own minds and hearts in the ways that we think about ourselves. We need the vital insight, obviously, of adopted and fostered people to improve the lives of children who are walking in our shoes. There are just as many ways to hold and analyze this disconnect between us all as there are ways to try to find our way to each other and to establish common ground. On my Instagram 2 days ago, I shared a microblog about how first, foster, and adoptive parents can approach adoptee spaces using the psychological concepts of concept versus process. By asking parents to consider the content of an adoptee's words, I'm asking them to look at the literal text and context of what the adoptee said and intended to say. By asking parents to then consider the underlying process, I'm asking them to consider their own emotional reaction, the memories that are brought up, the biases and the assumptions that they may have, and also unmet needs that they may have brought to the adoptee's content with them. To learn more about that, you can head on over to my Instagram to check out that post. In this video, I want to talk about a different approach that first, foster, and adoptive parents can have towards adoptees to foster their understanding of what we have to say, which brings me to review a January 2013 post that I published to my blog, which was entitled, "How to Read an Adoptee Blog Without Getting Offended." I do still agree with what I shared in that blog, but I want to take this opportunity to reshare those concepts with you in this video with some important updates and newer explanations. First, I no longer like the title that I used in that blog post, specifically the phrase "without getting offended." In 2013, perhaps the phrase "getting offended" was more straightforward to me. I was more comfortable talking about offense and even being able to safely admit to others when I was offended about something. However, this is 2020. Suggesting now that someone is offended has increasingly hardened in our culture as being an insult towards someone. Whether or not we mean it as an insult, the phrase "you're just offended" is too frequently used to pathologize a person for disagreeing or having feelings. I hope this video to be a tool for adoptees to use with their own families to help their families understand them. And I also hope that this video helps parents understand adoptee. If I use words that make it sound like I am belittling the exact same people that I'm actually trying to reach, I know I'm not going to get very far. My tips on Instagram were more about emotional regulation. For these tips in this video, I want to emphasize of how these tips are cognitive tools to use when approaching and interacting with adoptees online. Originally, I gave you 4 thoughts in the 2013 blog post to keep in mind when listening to adoptee voices. Today, I'm going to discuss and add 1 for a total of 5. I'm really getting into the list making, aren't I? Here are 5 thoughts to keep in mind when interacting in adoptee spaces online or offline. First, keep in mind that adoption is an institution, not a person. I have written and said this frequently throughout my career, that we should be able to discuss the institution of adoption without feeling critiqued as people. Sometimes when an adoptee says this is part of adoption that was hard for me or that I dislike, other people can interpret that as saying they're insulting adoption, which is an affront to me because I feel differently about adoption, or at least the parts that I experienced or know about. Think of it this way though. Do you feel like your marriage is undermined every time someone you know talks about how they got divorced? Do you feel like your church or religious institution is undermined just because someone doesn't attend the same building or service or denomination as you? If you chose to be married and have 2 kids, are you undermined by someone who is single and says that having 1 kid is enough because parenting is really freaking hard? Adoption, like all institutions, has laws, norms, customs, and practices. The adoption community has its own culture, its symbols, and its own terminology. We have to be able to discuss those things about adoption as it is, an institution. When any of us are upset with how someone's perceptions, personal worldview, application of ethics, and their own story may influence what others think about adoption as an institution, we have to stop ourselves and we need to ask ourselves, why do we need people to only see adoption in just one way? So this ties into my second point, which is to never talk someone out of sharing their grief. Parents need to make sure that they don't need adoptees to only voice certain words or feelings so as to manage the emotions that they, as parents, feel about adoption in their own lives. Something else I said on my Instagram stories 2 days ago, but in a different context, applies here too. Someone posed a question to fellow adoptee Angela Tucker, which she then shared with adoptees on her Instagram. The question asked her to explain why adoptees always seem so resentful. As I explained in my own answer to this question, this is first and foremost often a projection issue. Going back to processing content, like I mentioned earlier, is the content of what the adoptee is saying expressly, reasonably resentful, or what is the listener bringing to the table that causes them to interpret the adoptee this way? Anyone who listens to adoptees needs to attend to the assumptions that arise before they start commenting and engaging with that adoptee or with the adoptee audience that has gathered in that place. It's kind and important to do that and to ensure that you're not reflecting back to the adopted person what is a distorted picture of themselves to them. If we as adoptees aren't actually resentful, or maybe that emotion was appropriate in that moment for the actual content that we were speaking, reflecting this back to us, a distorted picture of what we actually were reflecting, is never going to get us anywhere or build common ground. In this same Instagram story, I also mentioned how difficult it can be for adoptees and other people with early complex childhood trauma to allow our words, our tone of voice, our body sensation, and our facial expressions to all match at the same time. For example, if we are saying something sad and can look sad and can sound sad and also can feel sad and feel safe enough for this congruency to occur, we definitely shouldn't be told that it's wrong. When we don't allow ourselves to match in this way, that can be from a variety of factors, such as how integrated our internal sense of interoception is due to developmental trauma. Or it could be from the story of ourselves and internalized while we were growing up based on what was reflected back to us by the adults around us that told us what was true about ourselves. Or it could even be because we learned to grow up not showing congruency in this way as a matter of survival and of being accepted because we maybe needed to manage the emotions and expectations of those around us. I learned from mainstream adoption culture around me from an early age that being grateful and sounding completely unbothered by any aspect of my adoption was what made other people comfortable with me, and it made me a good adoptee. The first time I realized that this was really a problem was when a parent came up to me after a adoption support group meeting when I was about 25. They thanked me for discussing a particularly disturbing part of my origin story nonchalantly. Because I had not made her feel uncomfortable, she appreciated that. And I thought of what a problem that was. My story should have made people feel uncomfortable because that part of my story is uncomfortable. And to be uncomfortable when I tell that part of my story means that someone else, is able to feel empathy with me and even my original mom. I didn't really think it was a good thing that I voiced and had facial expressions in such a way that no one felt the need to be uncomfortable and to empathize. My mom and I are deserving of empathy. When the content of our words is happy, we could expect our faces, tone, and body sensations to reflect happiness. When we are sharing grief, we cannot also expect that an adoptee do that with a neutral facial expression or a smile on their face or a cheeriness in their tone. Again, everyone needs to make sure that they're not expecting adoptees to be out of sync with how they actually think and feel just to manage the emotions of other people who may be reading or listening to our words and maybe just aren't ready to read or listen to our words. My fourth point, I think, especially drives home why everything that I've just discussed is important. A person approaching adoption from having been adopted and having arrangements made on their behalf of which they could not control will not approach adoption like a first parent who had the child that others had wanted to parent and may, for example, feel confused about how much the control they had or if they even had any at all. Someone who may have wanted their life to go very differently and absolutely most likely never intended for their child to feel any grief or pain as a result of being surrendered to adoption. This first parent and adoptee then absolutely cannot be expected to approach adoption from the perspective of an adoptive parent. To use one example from the vast majority of adoptive parents who pursue non-familial adoption due to infertility, the adoptee and first parents will not approach adoption in the same way as that adoptive parent who initially approached adoption potentially grief-stricken from the painful procedure and endless anticipation and disappointment of infertility and trying to bear a child. Although I emphasize that we can't expect adoptees to take on the perspectives of their first foster or adoptive parents, especially when adoptees are still children, I do emphasize that it is always important for parents to consider the perspective of adoptees, especially when adoptees are still children. Although you are not us, it is important that you empathize and try your best to understand what it's like to see the world through our eyes and the eyes of the inner emotional world of an adopted child. And fifth and finally, be mindful of how you value us. Yes, it is amazing for adoptees to be your go-to for better understanding your children and their experiences. Unfortunately, when this is the only thing that some parents value us for, it starts to feel more like labor than it does like a reciprocal relationship. Show up for us even when we aren't specific giving tailored parenting advice to your exact circumstances in your own parenting needs. Show up for us when we are talking about a completely different aspect of adoption and just could clearly use an ally. Be invested in us because you like us or you're willing to expand your capacity to like us, and not just because we may provide something that's useful to you in parenting. You've probably heard before that representation matters. I think representation matters in a lot of different ways, and this includes kids knowing that their parents are fans of adoptees online. I always think of how cool it would have been for my mom to have had access to adoptees accomplishing great things, and I would have gotten to see her watching them growing up. To wrap this all up, I want to say what I said in that 2013 blog post. None of us, not even me, get this right all of the time. Years ago, I definitely was not ready to hear the narratives of other adoptees. I was not ready to listen or to treat their stories with care. At that time in my life, I needed to investigate what being adopted meant to me so that I in turn could both glean from and contribute to other adoptees as a part of the adoption community. It is with gratitude for how others have treated my stories with kindness that I have sought to build empathy with those who live and experience adoption in return. Adoptees, first parents, adoptive parents, and extended families, foster parents, all have our different roles and perceptions in adoption. But first and foremost, we're human beings. The little human kindness goes a long way. That wraps it up for today. Thank you so much for watching. Again, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. I will hope to see you again next Tuesday. Bye, guys. I'm really getting into the list making, aren't I?